How you all doing? It's Christine here. You can find me on Instagram at Christine Grace Smith. It is my interpretation that what we see on TV and the music's played on our radio stations and in the charts are really an instrument for psychological operations that affect our behaviour and the values that we hold in modern culture. Welcome back to another episode of our Debunking the Lunacy series, where we attempt to rummage through the garbage bin of nonsense our modern culture has to offer us in today's society. I was having an in-depth conversation with my dad, as we usually do, when I first had the idea for this episode, and originally I was just going to focus on mainstream pop music and how I believe that certain values are instilled in us through a lot of our music, and that ultimately affects the way we behave in our culture and can possibly link to certain trends and patterns that we've seen over the last few decades. Whilst generally discussing pop culture as a whole, specifically relating to family life at home, my dad pointed out to me that actually there's a lot of what we see on TV that seems to reflect these trends that we were discussing, from not only his generation but all the way down to mine too. So thanks, Dad, for inspiring a large bulk of this episode. I grew up in the early 2000s watching TV with my parents, listening to the radio on my stereo, and whenever we went in a car ride, the radio was a regular part of my childhood, as I'm sure it was for many. As much as it cringes me to admit, when I was younger, me and my friends would spend hours creating dances to many popular songs of the time, thinking we were the next hit dance group, good enough to appear on Britain's Got Talent, of course. And once completed and practiced, we would proudly head downstairs to show our parents the dances that we'd come up with, whilst our parents would try to contain their laughter at how ridiculous we obviously looked. When you're young, typically you don't understand most adult themes, especially not when you hear it in music. Around my teenage years, I began to recoil when I would realise the true meanings of a lot of my beloved childhood anthems. We really thought that the milkshake Kellis was referring to that brought all the boys to the yard literally meant milkshake. We had no idea that the bottle of Jack that Kesha was telling us she brushed her teeth with in the morning referred to Jack Daniel's whiskey. And frankly, it didn't cross our minds what Akon was smacking, it was just a catchy song. I used to love the song Carry Out by Timbaland featuring Justin Timberlake, and I won't sit here and lie, it's definitely a song that incites nostalgia when I hear it replayed now, but it's just really funny and quite odd when I think how I used to listen to this song when I was around 9-10 and just completely oblivious to the fact that they were not referring to a supersized meal from a fast food restaurant. In fact, they were referring to a supersized something else. Aside from music, if you're in the UK, chances are you quite possibly grew up in one of the millions of households that tuned into our nation's favourite soaps every weeknight. This was certainly the case for my childhood. My mum was absolutely obsessed. We had Emmerdale on first on ITV, then you'd head over to BBC One for EastEnders, and then back to ITV for Coronation Street, all conveniently situated around each other so that you would never miss a minute of any of them. I remember around age 8 or 9 finding out that Albert Square in EastEnders was not actually a real place, and I was like, whoa, my whole life is a lie. Because these shows really do seem like they're aiming to reflect reality. I don't know, perhaps I was just a really naive child, but yeah. Albert Square is not a real place. Even back with my parents' generation, soaps have been a huge part of British culture. In 1987, the longest running soap opera, having first aired in 1960, Coronation Street amassed viewing figures of around 26 million views. Given that the population at the time was at about 56.8 million, that means 47%, almost half of the UK's population, watched this national soap opera. Whilst we were having this conversation, my dad basically highlighted to me how on all of these soaps, there's never any couples that have been together for years and years. They're meant to be portraying life, but they're not. They're just after storylines. He pointed out to me that people who've been married 30 years, well, that's not much of a storyline, but people who are having it off with someone else, well, that's drama, and that's a storyline. But people seem to have confused this idea of soaps being a portrayal of life, and now we in our culture don't see much wrong with someone having it off, as my dad would say, with someone else. He basically pointed out to me a lot of the hypocrisy in portraying these stories as real life, and what we don't see is the reality. For example, how any of these people are making any money. They don't show you the reality of these storylines, because in reality, once you're separated, one of you might not be working, or at least you no longer have the benefit of shared income of two earners in the same household, and one of the two is going to lose the home that they once shared. Someone has to pay for it in the end, one way or another. It's this theme that my dad was referring to that we keep seeing in soaps. He told me how life isn't the same as it was in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And to quote what my dad actually said, he said, "I'm not saying that things were perfect. I'm not saying that. but you don't get any of these programs portraying a family life. Things aren't perfect in any relationship, but it just seems like all of these shows, and as they've gone on, people seem to be jumping from one relationship to another, and that seems to be a trend now in society of how people are. And he's right, this observation is definitely fair. A report from the Office of National Statistics shows that from the 1960s and 70s, when a lot of these soaps began, divorce has exponentially been on the rise. Now, of course, I can't sit here and say that this is the final conclusion and that all divorce is down to soap operas. Of course not, I'm not saying that. But it is an interesting pattern, especially given that there was a point in time where almost half of our population here in the UK tuned into these storylines. And there certainly is much more of a trend now of transient relationships, definitely now than ever before. The numbers are far fewer today, but at least for my generation as children, and definitely our parents' generations too, soaps were definitely a big part of our culture. Much like before the days of Spotify in its prime, British radio stations such as Capital, Kiss, Heart, Radio 1 were often played in many cars, households and offices around the nation, as they still are today. The genesis for this particular topic first sparked up in my mind back when I was selling photocopiers a few months ago. I worked in an office and every single day the radio was on. I actually hadn't listened to the radio for many years since things like iTunes and Spotify had become more easily accessible, so it was unusual for me to be exposed to much more pop music again. I remember I'd be sitting at my desk and I would hear glimpses of lyrics from songs that would just shock me, and I would turn and say to my colleague, like, did I hear that right? And they would confirm I did in fact hear the lyrics correctly. I'll take you through a little tour into my brain so you can see what I'm trying to get at, or perhaps you won't see anything, you'll just think I'm a bit of a loony, but nevertheless I will digress. The first line that got my attention was "I Might My Ex," sung by a very feminine voice with a jingle-esque rhythm in the background. It was very catchy but also really creepy to me, and I instantly said, wait, did I just hear that right? And it was confirmed by my colleague, I did in fact hear it correctly, and I had to look up the lyrics and see what was going on with the whole song, and I was further astonished. My first thought was, imagine if it was a guy singing this song. If you don't know the song, please go and read the lyrics. It's by SZA. The song is called Kill Bill. Just read it and try to imagine if it was a guy singing these exact same lyrics. I very much doubt it would be a chart-topping song played on the radio for children to hear. I'm sure many members of the public would have a complaint to make if it was. This instantly reminded me of that song "Oh She's Sweet But a Psycho" by Ava Max, if you guys remember that. I thought, imagine if we changed this to a guy singing it and instead he's saying, "Oh, I'm hot but a narcissistic abuser." Two words that I know women love to use to describe many men nowadays, especially ones that they've met in their lives, particularly in regards to failed past relationships. I can almost guarantee that the responses we would see if those were the lyrics sung by a guy would be very different to the reaction and the responses that the Sweet But Psycho song got. Another one was Meghan Trainor's song Mother. The first lines I heard again that made me have to search up the lyrics just to confirm that I wasn't going mad. She says, "I am your mother. You listen to me. Stop all that mansplaining, no one's listening. Tell me who gave you permission to speak. I am your mother. You listen to me." Again, imagine if it was a man talking about a woman. Imagine if this was a man singing this song. It's just the double standards that make me feel a bit uneasy, but also what kind of message are we sending to young boys and girls? Boys, you have no valid voice. You're only allowed to speak when granted permission by a woman. That is in no way empowering to women, but it's oppressive to men. Empowering one sex, race, religion, anything for that matter, should not be at the expense or oppression of another. The song started to feel all the more eerie when I started to hear Meghan Trainor's voice in this song as this kind of almost demonic matriarchy voice that seems to be infiltrating our music, our TV, and even our institutions. Let me stop there before I spoil another episode, but be sure to come back for that one. I am your mother. You listen to me. The voice of the Matrix. Big brother is out. Big sister is in. Even when we just look at the top songs of 2023 so far, why does everything feel so kind of like we're in a horror movie? It's kind of dystopian, almost satanic, this theme that recurs in even just the names of the songs. You've got Boy's a Liar, Anti-Hero, Messy in Heaven, Creepin', Unholy, Bad Habits, Afraid to Feel, Red Flags, Shivers, Vampire, Unhealthy, Disconnect, Toxic Trait, Don't Say Love. It just feels weird. Just look at the difference from song titles in the 80s in the charts, just for comparison. Here's some song titles from the 80s. Relax. I Just Called to Say I Love You. The Power of Love. Together We Are Beautiful. True. You Can't Hurry Love. Freedom. I Want to Wake Up With You. It all seems to be about love and union, and now it seems like everything is this separation, this I don't need you attitude. I don't know, perhaps this is just my far too imaginative mind bordering on the profound and insanity getting away with me, but hey, it was Aristotle who said that no great mind ever existed without a touch of madness. You may well think I'm just going far too deep into my analysis, and maybe I am, but hey, perhaps a few of you may understand my train of thought. Again, if we look at the lyrics for Sam Smith's Unholy, there's this theme of unloyalty, breakdown of family life, everyone's deceiving someone, there's betrayal. The lyrics in this particular song read, "Mummy don't know, daddy's getting hot at the body shop doing something unholy, and he left his kids at home." That and the music video is bordering on graphic. You can watch my reaction to that music video on my channel. I'd seen some of the live shows of that song. I read the lyrics. That opened my mind to it even more, and then I watched the original music video. You can go watch my reaction. The worst part is, they are so bloody catchy. You can't get them out of your head, which means that more often than not, these themes and lyrics are circling around in our minds, whether consciously or not, for longer than just the duration of the songs. Psychologists and neurologists have studied the effects of music on the brain and the relationship between music and memory to understand why some songs get so stuck in our heads. This led to the concept of the earworm being popularized by the University of, I think it's pronounced Cincinnati? By marketing professor James Claris. By definition, an earworm is a bit of music that pops into your head and sticks there well after it's stopped playing, no matter how hard you try and get it out. I know we've all experienced that at some point in our lives. I currently have Sam Smith's Unholy stuck in my head and it's driving me nuts. Psychology research says that it's down to something called a phonological loop, and this was discovered by scientists Graham Hitch and Alan Badley in 1974. The brain-ear memory loop consists of the phonological store, the inner ear, which remembers speech sounds in order, and the articulatory rehearsal system, the inner voice, which repeats those sounds so you don't forget them. There are 3 distinct features that can constitute an earworm. First one being, it's short, about 15 to 30 seconds, the conventional length of a pop chorus. It's simple, the lyrics are easy to remember, most pop lyrics are pretty simple and easy to remember, and it's repetitive. It has a lively tempo and a simple melody. Cue all of the songs that I have already mentioned. We can see that the messages portrayed in music and the kind of things that we're seeing on TV are certainly reflected in our culture through the values that we hold and the behaviours that we exert in our society. Without any depth of research, I think most of us can conclude that those themes in our music and television do reflect what's happening in our societies, and that's just upon observation alone. When you do delve a bit deeper into the why and how of these things, the truth uncovered, at least to me, is quite alarming. How could it possibly be that watching a bit of harmless telly and listening to some music could incite new values and behaviour in us? Well, it's no secret, this is exactly what happens. The BBC even has an article you can read titled "The Coded Messages in Hit Songs," where you can read how a lot of music does contain hidden messages. Whilst of course the BBC isn't going to tell you or show you any sinister messaging, the admittance or acknowledgement of this hidden messaging in music alone is enough to prompt myself at least to want to investigate a bit further. Music is especially a profound tool to connect to some of the deepest parts of the human brain. It's a phenomenon that scientists to this day are still trying to understand fully. It's not something to be played with. Subliminal messaging has been a technique used to fuel our consumerist culture for decades, and we're exposed to a lot of it every single day. Subliminal messages are basically any stimuli that's displayed for a short amount of time that activates multiple core areas within our brains, such as emotional activation, memory recognition, and visual processing. Most movies these days run at about 30 frames per second, which means most frames that we are fed at just the perfect amount of time to affect our brains subliminally. Music videos tend to be at about 24 frames per second, which is an even smaller frequency, so perhaps they even have a deeper effect. Subliminal messaging is a great source of mind control because it's so subtle that we aren't even conscious of it when we're exposed to it. In the 1940s and 50s, lots of subliminal messaging can be found in cartoons such as Looney Tunes and a few Disney movies. It's actually quite funny, some of them, but yeah, it's also quite scary as well. A study conducted in 2002 by Starhan, Spencer and Zanna in relation to subliminal messaging in marketing found that while subliminal messaging may not be able to create drives and emotions in and of themselves, they do accelerate and exaggerate emotions and drives that are already present. So if I'm not thirsty, it might be quite hard to subliminally program me to become thirsty, but if I'm already thirsty and then you subliminally program me to think of drinking a certain product, for example, then chances are I'm gonna want to go for that product more because I was already thirsty. This study particularly piqued my curiosity because if you look at a society where divorce rates are skyrocketing, family life is on the decline, and you then add into the pop culture songs and storylines further reiterating the acceptance and somewhat praise of these things, you accelerate the whole process even more. As we've already seen, a lot of what is portrayed through music and TV, we are seeing trends and patterns in real life. What agenda, what messages are being pushed? And we have to ask ourselves, why is it being accelerated? And do they have our best interests at heart? Studies have shown that people who watch copious amounts of television experience more drastic cognitive declines in their older years. They also seem to have lower volumes of grey matter in their brains. So if we know that these things are weakening the mind, if you then expose that weakened mind to programming at the same time, chances are whatever you're programming is going to be more successful because the mind's already weakened. An article posted to the New York Times by Jonathan Rothwell titled "You Are What You Watch: The Social Effects of TV" looked at several compelling findings. The article tells us how some of the best research has been done on the television program Sesame Street. The show, which began in 1969, was meant to develop early literacy, numeracy, and emotional skills for children of preschool age. In a detailed analysis, researchers randomly assigned groups of low-income children aged 3 to 5 into an experimental group and a control group. In the experimental group, parents were given access to the show if they lacked it and encouraged in person once a month to have their children watch the show. Over 6 months, the experimental group gained 5.4.1 Q points, a large effect, relative to the control group, and showed stronger evidence of learning along several other dimensions. Gains in cognitive performance were especially large for those who viewed the show frequently, relative to those who did so rarely or never. This in itself shows the power of what we are exposed to through what we watch and what we listen to. This example is a very pleasant one, with a great outcome, but Sesame Street stopped airing over 22 years ago, and so much has changed since then. Look at what we're exposing our children's fragile minds to now in the age of social media. What values are we allowing them to develop? What are we adults being exposed to? The majority of what we watch and listen to is not promoting love, union, and peace. It's selfishness, it's greed, it's brands, it's status, and infidelity. We are what we consume. If you like this video, please be sure to like and share. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can keep up to date with all of my content. If you didn't like this video, please let me know where I can improve. Constructive criticism is very much welcomed here. And be sure to check out my channel to see some of my reactions to some of the music videos I was referring to here today. What patterns do you notice today that could potentially lead to trends in our value systems and culture within our society? Why do you think this is? Is it possible that there's an agenda to destroy and divide relationships and union amongst us? Will the family unit be nothing but an outdated myth in years to come? And why is this happening? Please let me know down below in the comments what you think. The only way that we can develop as society and as individuals is through learning about each other's perspective and ideas on the world. And as always, let's try our best to remain harmonious in the adversity of opinion. See you next time.